Welcome to the NIIMBL Project Call 2.2 Stage 2 webinar. I'm Chris Roberts, Associate Institute Director for NIIMBL. I'm going to take you through the slides in the webinar this afternoon. This is going to be recorded and posted later. We'll have ways for questions to be sent to us at the end of the webinar for those who can be online today and otherwise online, and we'll post those as an FAQ as we go forward. So PC 2.2 is a two-stage process similar to PC 2.1. We finished with the first stage, which is in gray at the top of this slide. So the concept paper stage, the summit, and the invitation to full proposals have all been completed. We're currently in the teaming stages. That's been ongoing heavily this week into next week and beyond, and we'll keep that up. We'll talk about that a little bit later at the end of the webinar. So full proposals, the date that's listed there is going to look a little bit different for those of you who had been paying attention to the details earlier, where we had previously listed May 9th. That's changed to May 16th. We bumped that back just recently in order to give teams more time for both teaming and for proposal preparation. That will push back the review process slightly, but ultimately we still manage or plan to keep to our overall deadline of being able to reach funding decisions with the governing committee and make final funding announcements by the end of June or thereabouts. So at a high level, so some basic overall guidelines. NIIMBL anticipates awarding up to, not necessarily as much as, 4.5 million in NIIMBL dollars to support projects under PC 2.2. This, of course, is at the discretion of the governing committee, so that's yet to be decided what the total funding levels will be. For a given project, the maximum funding level depends on the project size and type, or let's just call it size. So large proposals are up to 600,000 in the request for NIIMBL dollars, with a 1 to 1.25 match. That is, for every $1 of NIIMBL dollars requested, 1.25 in cost share needs to be proposed at a minimum. For small, it's a 300K max and a 1-to-1 ratio. The maximum duration for any project, technical, workforce, small or large, is 12 months within PC 2.2. And we'll come back to that in a little bit. So your eligibility criteria are, first of all, probably obviously that the concept was invited to a full proposal, and that therefore you're already part of phase 2. The project teams must adhere to a few other pieces that are outlined below. So you have to have at least 2 distinct organizations on your project team, and of course all of your project members need to be NIIMBL members, or project partners need to be NIIMBL members. If you're looking at partners that as of today are not yet NIIMBL members, that can still work, but they need to be NIIMBL members by 5 p.m. Eastern on the 29th of April. And in order to be considered a member, you need to have at least a partially executed NIIMBL membership agreement where the new member, the new partner, has signed and is just waiting for a countersignature from NIIMBL. We also welcome and encourage participation by federal employees and federal stakeholders. And for any who may be viewing this or considering joining a team, you can review information that we have on the NIIMBL PC 2.2 information online. And we also encourage you to contact Kelly Rogers with information here, who can help make sure that you have the relevant details and are factoring in all the questions you may need to answer around how to participate. So in terms of the submission process itself, I mentioned a few moments ago, the deadline is Thursday, May 16th, again, 5 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll come back to it again in a moment, but do bear in mind that the timing of that is strict. We do not have any freedom to push that back any further, even for the teams that may have had issues along the way. So if you anticipate any issues, we encourage you to get online, use the online submission system, which the details are outlined briefly here. Test drive and make sure that everything's working properly well in advance of the deadline. If you have run into any questions or concerns, there's a contact information at the bottom, projectcalls@niimble.org, and that's a general email you want to use for any questions that come up along the way as you prepare your submission. So I'm not going to read through this slide in all the detail, but the key thing is that there's an online submission hub. There's a link there. All PIs will be given an account on that hub, and you'll have login information that you'll be able to set up if you haven't already. It is the same hub that you used for submitting a concept paper. However, now it's a slightly different section of the hub, but otherwise the details should look the same for you when you go to log in. There will be a confirmation of any submission that will be sent by email to whomever is logged in to ultimately submit. So if a PI designates a proxy to be able to submit, for example, maybe a research office for a university, the email will go to whoever is submitting at the time of submission. We do highlight that your submissions should be marked as NIIMBL confidential to be in accordance with the bylaws, with the exception that your abstract and your title should not contain confidential information, since those ultimately can be released to the public in the later stages of the process, for example, after funding decisions are made. All right, moving on to a bit more detail. The fully detailed evaluation criteria are contained in the RFPs. We're going to talk about, there are two RFPs, one for the technical projects, PC 2.2T, and one for the workforce, PC 2.2W. We'll go over that one in a second. But the website listed here has both of them, and you can get the full details there. The differences between the next two slides are not large. We just call out that there are some differences between the technical and the workforce evaluation criteria. So we really refer you to those websites and those PDFs in order to get the full details. But at a high level, the administrative criteria are that you need to have the team composition we just discussed, minimum of 2 partners, NIIMBL members, etc. Your budget needs to be within the constraints that we just mentioned. You have to have all the required elements of the proposal. We'll talk about that in a moment. And the submission time needs to be within the deadlines. And all times are Eastern time. The technical criteria from the technical proposals, it's a 40-60 split. It's very similar to what it was in PC 2.1. These are high-level overviews of it, and again, you're referred to the website and the RFP for more details. There's also a committee review that runs in parallel with the technical panel reviews. There is a little bit of overlap, but in general, they're reviewing different basic elements, and some of these, and there are different committees that are involved along the way. Similar for the workforce side of things, the administrative criteria are all exactly the same, and then the technical and the committee criteria are somewhat different and tailored a bit more towards the workforce side. One of the ones that will be called out is around the sustainability side of things, in terms of, we'll get into more details in a second on that. So the full proposal elements, or other proposal elements, such as the various appendices. Some of these are exactly the same as in previous project calls. We'll talk a bit more about the project plan from Appendix C in a little bit. And again, just to reiterate, when you're talking about budget, each individual organization does need its own workbook to explain its budget, and then those will be rolled up into a consideration for the overall team as a whole. Just to finish up the full proposal elements in a formal way, there are the additional appendices, so it often comes up, are references considered part of that 15-page max? No, they're not. They should be submitted as part of Appendix E or as Appendix E. If needed, you can have a list of acronyms. If it makes sense, you can have additional letters of commitment for volunteers that make sense fitting in your particular proposal that are not actual partners that are going to commit cost share or seek funding from NIIMBL. If you have questions again about that, that's sort of a case-specific example. You can reach out to us and we're happy to talk with you about that. One thing I will call out that's a little bit different in this project call than the prior ones, Appendix H, which is the Tier 3 industry member exemption or exemption request, I should say. In prior ones, every proposal needed to include that if they did not include a Tier 3 industry member. For this project call, only technical proposals are required to have an Appendix H exemption request if you feel that the scope of your project really isn't a fit for having a Tier 3 industry member. Workforce projects do not need to consider this. We highly encourage that you do have Tier 3 industry members, but if it doesn't fit for your workforce project, then a workforce one doesn't need to have it. All right, so just a little bit of clarity and adding a bit of detail around the budget workbooks. So these are required from the lead organization and any partner organization that's requesting funding and committing cost share or committing cost share. Right, so the lead organization is required no matter what, and for your partner organizations, this is required only if you're requesting funding or committing cost share. Your budgets should map to the work breakdown structure, and we haven't enumerated or elaborated on the WBS, but we'll get into that in a moment. But the key thing is that the elements that you break out in your WBS need to tie back to the budget in a way that it's clear to see that you've worked out what the cost is, or your estimated cost at least, for each element in the WBS. And again, if you have questions or issues, it's the same website again, projectcalls@niimble.org. And we recommend, it's not required, but we highly recommend that when you do break out your WBS into its different elements and tie those to the budgets, if at all possible, make sure that your cost share ratios between direct costs or NIIMBL dollars and what you're cost sharing help to meet the ratios that you need, whether it's a large or a small proposal. So it's the 1 to 1.25 or the 1 to 1.1 ratio. A few details, especially for those who aren't used to dealing with some of the federal regulations. All costs that you propose to be to include in your budget, I should say, have to be allowable under the federal regulations, 2 CFR 200, sometimes called Uniform Guidance, and also within the Department of Commerce Financial Assistance Terms and Conditions. So if those are not familiar terms to you as you're developing your budget, feel free to reach out to us and we can help you with that. For those who are familiar with those, that's already something you're used to working under. A few other key points that sometimes come up: construction costs are not allowed. Project teams are encouraged to obtain state cost share funding if that's available to you. Some of the state members are already looking to do this. We do need to highlight that the deadlines for securing those commitments from your states do not necessarily align with those for the deadlines we've set for this project call. Typically, they occur much in advance of that, so you want to be having those conversations now. And if it helps, you can use Appendix G to confirm, to provide written confirmation of that state support. One thing that has come up as a question on the most recent rounds of proposals and project funding, funded projects, is that teams didn't always realize that they're required to attend an in-person project kickoff meeting if they're selected for funding, of course. and they need to present at the annual national meeting. So you are certainly encouraged and to include a budget for the travel, for example, to attend those meetings. That is certainly viable within what we're able to support for you. So let's talk for a moment about some of the best practices that we can share with you from prior teams around developing your project plan, and particularly the WBS. Gantt charts and just assigning who's responsible for what is probably something you're more familiar with, but for what we need in terms of WBSs in order to allow the proposal review to be most effective, as well as to make our teams most successful if you're selected for funding, is what we're trying to capture here. So sort of at a high level, first thing, think of how you approach writing one of these and pulling this together as a team. So first of all, it needs to be done as a team. Right? It shouldn't be just a guess as to what you plan to do. This should be a well worked out and discussed plan of what the work will actually entail. Remember, these are only 1 year projects to start. We realize that teams may have a longer term vision of where you'd like to go, but the proposal you need to put in needs to focus on year one. Keep it within that scope. Some things that have come up in the past that we want to highlight is you want to avoid dependent tasks occurring in parallel or concurrently. Right? That's really not a good sign for success. It's a high risk that something that one task relies on for the other is going to result in a no-go for the project. All right, so you basically keep those as being serial. One way to think about this, particularly for those who don't come from an industrial background, is you should focus on an industrial approach to the scope and budgeting. But that's not only in the sense of the 1 year, but also in terms of what do you need to get done to show success for your team and your project at the end of that 1 year, and realizing you need to keep within that 1 year. This is not one which will just be extended through a typical add-on towards the end. Keep your WBS elements specific, quantitative, and measurable. Again, this really comes down to having detailed discussions with your team members as to what you really plan to do rather than just broad brushstrokes. Right? So err on the side of specificity, and those larger tasks that you might have in mind, break them into smaller ones so everyone on the team really understands what it is you're proposing and where they fit in. Within that, we also need to stress that WBSs that do not include established go-no-go decisions along the way, and this cannot be all pushed to the end of the project period. You need to have go-no-go decisions along the way, otherwise it shows that it's not a very well thought out plan. And that will be reflected in how the panels and the committees will review this. So sometimes it helps to have concrete examples. So we're not trying to call out any one particular WBS in the past, so we're essentially coming up with generic versions of this. So 2 examples of things that are just not useful ways to approach this, because they're too high level, they're too qualitative, they're not really easily assessed. So one would be your model predicts the behavior that you had seen experimentally. Well, what behavior, what type of prediction is this? Quantitative, qualitative? What's good enough to show success? You need to be able to define that, and you will be held accountable to it. So keep those realistic, but at the same time, the more qualitative and nebulous you make it, the more likely it is that this won't be evaluated as a well thought out plan. Similarly, when you talk about assays being validated, while it may be clear in your head what validated means, you need to spell it out so that the evaluation committees and teams can see where you're really going with this. So it may be a bit more work, but do be more granular and spell things out more. It'll be much more useful if you spell things out, for example, by giving in terms of concentrations, quantities, purities, thresholds, right? And be as quantitative as possible, as time constrained as you can be. All right, so just a few other lessons learned that we can share at this stage. Some other things that have come up that can significantly delay contracting, or you should be factoring in as you build in your discussions, because it can derail teams in other ways, is please make sure that if you are considering any work to be done outside the United States, that for us to be able to support that through NIIMBL, it will require prior approval before any of that work can be done or 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 covered financially by the institute. Um, that doesn't mean it'll have to be approved prior to the proposal submission, but do realize that if that you must have the work really needs to be done in the U.S. in order for us to support it. Now, any research that's considered human subjects research or vertebrate animals research will require approval from at least the lead institution and NIST. You may not necessarily have that approval at the time of proposal, but it will have to be in place in order for you to begin any work within any contracted work later. Um, if it's not clear to you whether or not the work you're proposing falls under those restrictions, you should reach out to us whether or not you're assuming it's exempt or not. That will help during the proposal process, even though you may still have question marks as you move through. Then the next one that is, I think, usually not on most PI's radar is that it's not always clear that the people who are preparing the proposal have a full awareness of all of the IP and legal restrictions that their organization may be under. So rather than put together a proposal in a vacuum without any consideration of intellectual property or freedom to operate in constraints that each of the partners on the team may have, you really need to get advice from legal counsel from all of the partners involved. This can save a huge amount of effort and headaches, and even potentially, it can avoid issues with difficulties with contracting later. So again, we're not going to get into details, but it's something where if you have questions or concerns, or you're just not sure that it's something you need to worry about, please reach out to us and we can work with you on that. All right, so here's just a list of resources. Again, this webinar is being recorded and it'll be posted later, and you can always refer back to these slides. These are all available on our website in various places, and if you have a hard time finding anything, please just reach out to the contact information that we have here. Again, projectcalls@niimble.org. And so in the last slide or so, what I'm going to do is just give a little bit more clarity and some recommendations around the teaming side of things. So to make this most effective, we're going to help facilitate PIs getting in contact with the large industry members, Tier 1, Tier 2 affiliates. Um, if you'd like help in trying to find small to medium manufacturers, the SMM members, that's something we can help with as well. It's not as structured as it is with the larger industry members. Of course, you should have the freedom, as we're showing on the left-hand side of this diagram. Certainly with the SMMs, reach out, you have access to the portal. With the larger industry members, the most efficient way to do it is to go through us. In particular, I lead that team, so go through me, because what you don't want to do is kind of get lost in the shuffle working with people who aren't completely dialed in on all of what their member organization, especially the large members, what they're trying to balance in terms of the different constraints and where they can put their resources. So you certainly may have plenty of your other contacts, but if you're seeking partnering with one of the larger organizations, one of our larger industry members, I should say, your best bet is to come through me, and I will already be reaching out to you, or my team will be in the next few days to weeks to help facilitate all that. That being said, of course, we have many academic members, not-for-profit organizations, of course, federal stakeholders, and all of these are certainly fair game as partners. Again, it's a minimum of 2 independent organizations need to be on a given project team, but whatever composition that makes sense for your team is what you should pursue. If you do have, and just to highlight the last bullet, if you do have potential members who are partners you'd like to work with, there's no problem with that as long as you can assure that they're going to be members by the 29th of April in order to fulfill that criterion, so we can make sure that all proposals that are submitted have all partners being members. And again, if you have questions about that, reach out to me. We've already covered the review process. I think with that, we'll wrap up and leave time for questions. And again, you can chat your questions via WebEx if you happen to be online right now. If you're only able to view this remotely, you can email to us at projectcalls@niimble.org and send your questions, and we'll be happy to get back to you. Thanks everyone for your time. We really appreciate it. We're going to go on pause for a moment now and take any questions through the chat function in WebEx, and then we'll go from there.